Academic and author Gad Saad told a House of Commons Science Committee that DEI hiring in science has no effect on the researchers' capacity to make new discoveries.
Several industry leaders in Canada are piling on to the ongoing criticism of public funds granted to a Chinese shipyard to build ferries in British Columbia.
Heritage Minister Steven Guilbeault pledged to investigate a Montreal Magazine that receives public funds after it published a hit piece on U.S. conservative activist Charlie Kirk just a day after his assassination. Hello, Canada. It's Friday, September 26th. This is the True North Daily Brief. I'm Cosmin, Dzsurdzsa.
And I'm Walid Tamtam.
We've got you covered with all the news you need to know. Let's discuss the top stories of the day and the True North exclusives you won't hear anywhere else. Diversity quotas are a, quote, affront to research excellence, author and academic Gad Saad told a House of Commons Science Committee on Wednesday, clashing with a Liberal MP over the impact of identity-based hiring and funding on Canadian science. At the September 24th hearing of the Standing Committee on Science and Research, Liberal MP Talib Noor Mohammed asked Saad for specific examples of how diversity, equity, and inclusion rules had lowered research quality.
You know, listening to you today, I guess one of the questions that came to mind that I'd love if you could share with us is any empirical studies that you can cite that show that diversity initiatives actually harm the quality or objectivity of scientific research?
Thank you for your kind words. It's lovely to hear that people in the committee are reading my work, so thank you for that. I mean, I can certainly try to come. I don't have the citations in front of me, but there is no conceivable reason why diversity along my sexual orientation or my skin color or whether I'm two-spirit or non-binary is going to improve our capacity to map the human genome or better understand the distribution of prime numbers. Science liberates us from the shackles of our personal identities. It's an epistemological tool that democratizes our capacity to seek science. So by definition, science should be free of all that stuff. But if you want references, I can certainly try to whip some up for you.
I would love some.
The MP acknowledged the importance of meritocracy, but argued that historical inequality makes it, quote, much harder to measure merit in systems where access to education, the funding, and networks has historically been unequal. Saad countered that barriers to entry should be removed, but not replaced with quotas.
Wherever we see that there are truly systemic barriers to entry for any group, then we need to eradicate those. But that doesn't come from saying that only queer people who are non-binary get to be a professor of artificial intelligence at the University of Waterloo. I mean, imagine how insane that makes us look globally.
Saad called the growth of identity-based research funding, quote, grotesque, and warned that public trust in academia is eroding when parasitic ideas replace merit. So, Walid, this was quite the heated exchange here during this committee meeting. What other arguments were presented at the committee against DEI hiring and acceptance standards?
Well, Gad Saad wasn't alone in this committee as a witness. His criticism, his testimony mirrored comments reported by other witnesses, including Canadian professor of politics at the University of Buckingham, Eric Cosmin, who said DEI metrics, quote, create the conditions for delegitimized research funding. And researcher Robert Thomas, who cautioned that the government policy goals of DEI are, quote, displacing focus on the individual's work itself. So between those two views, there's additionally the concern around the conditions of funding could create a situation where that funding could show up, given public backlash and given a questioning of the legitimacy of that project itself. A lot of research in Canada is funded by taxpayer dollars to our universities. That could definitely create a much more let's say, delegitimized research industry and eventually cause a showing up of funds and innovation. And on the side of researcher Robert Thomas, of course, the focus instead of the actual work and product of research would be the identity of who is doing that research. So a health report would be more emphasized on the race of the researcher or reporter, on the academic, rather than the actual product evidence-based quality of that report or of that academic unit. BC Ferries is facing a wave of criticism from industry leaders after awarding a contract to a Chinese shipyard, with many arguing the decision highlights a lack of political will rather than a shortage of domestic capacity. Public outrage has been expressed since the news first emerged regarding BC Ferries' selection of the PRC-backed China Merchants Industry Weihai shipyards. Matters were made worse when it came to light that the financing to construct the 4 new vessels would come from taxpayers in the form of a $1 billion low-interest loan from the Canada Infrastructure Bank. Leaders in the steel and shipbuilding industry testified during a standing committee on transport, infrastructure, and communities meeting on Thursday, calling the contract, quote, highly offensive, frustrating, and with no regard for the long-term benefits. United Steelworkers National Director for United Steelworkers, Marty Warren, said, quote, our shipyards were set up to fail even before they had a chance. Conservative MP Leslie Lewis highlighted how many union members pay taxes that go to the CIB's billion-dollar fund, asking Warren about its effect on the industry. Warren said, quote, when we just race to the bottom for the cheapest labor, we really do lose the taxpayers' base. A lot of these jobs are good jobs. Raise a family, perhaps own a home, retire, and dignity. When that work is not provided to Canadians, we lose the tax base for hospitals, education, and infrastructure. The Chinese now cover 65% of maritime production compared to only 5% 10 years ago. How do you react to that, to see that we're a bit of an accomplice in the fact that China is taking over nearly the entire global market for ship production? Warren called for a, quote, clear and forcible Buy Canada, Buy Clean policy. So Cosmin, a question for you here. Prime Minister Mark Carney has been talking about federal procurement having a, quote, Buy Canada strategy going forward. Are the Liberals likely to do anything to ensure provinces are taking the same approach, such as BC?
Yeah, honestly, it sounds like more talk than action from Carney. And we've heard him play this song and dance consistently about buy Canadian, we're going to increase interprovincial trade, etc., when it's politically convenient. And then Ottawa turns around and signs off on funding for this billion-dollar deal that ships Canadian tax money and jobs overseas to China. And that's the irony here, because when the US hits us with tariffs, the Liberals wave that flag and say, oh, we're supporting Canadian workers, Canadian products. But when it's China, suddenly Ottawa's fine with handing over a $1 billion loan and letting a state-owned shipyard take the work. So clearly a double standard that doesn't just look weak, it actively undermines Canadian jobs, the apprenticeships we could have had, and potentially even our national security, considering a lot of the concerns around Chinese technology, espionage, corporate espionage, etc. And that's why Canadians are so frustrated. The provinces, some of them, have already shown that they're willing to approach Buy Canada policies. Now, BC said they were going to buy Canadian. They're going to exclude the United States from, purchasing agreements, contracts for the government. But here they are also leading the charge on this BC Ferries contract. So there's totally another about face happening at the provincial level, because when push came to shove with Washington, they present one image, but when it's convenient and potentially even profitable for them with China, it's totally the other picture. Heritage Minister Steven Guilbeault said he would look into the Montreal Magazine Cult Montreal after it printed a column titled, quote, "To hell with Charlie Kirk," the day after the U.S. conservative activist was assassinated on a public stage. While testifying at the Commons Canadian Heritage Committee on September 24th, Conservative MP Rachel Thomas pressed Guilbeault on why federal funds flowed to the publication through the Canada Periodical Fund. Thomas cited a September 11th column that mocked Kirk's death and ended with, quote, "You reap what you sow." Rachel questioned if taxpayer dollars should subsidize such content. Guilbeault, speaking in French, replied that his department was not aware of the article and said he would, quote, "quickly look into this with the department and see what in fact was printed, and convey this to all the members of the committee." He added that, quote, "spreading hate has no place in the public discourse in Canada," and promised, quote, "if the organization does not deserve to continue receiving government funding, the funding will be withdrawn." Public records show Cult Montreal has received multiple grants from Canadian Heritage under the Canada Periodical Fund, including $46,719 in 2020 and smaller amounts in subsequent years. If you were to just look through the variety of funds and mechanisms that the federal government uses to distribute taxpayer money, you'd realize there's a lot of institutions in this country that receive public funds but publish very biased work or produce very biased research. Is the government here likely to actually take action by withdrawing funds to Cult Montreal, or is Steven Guilbeault just saying that because he has to, Walid?
I think he's saying it because he has to in the committee under that kind of pressure, given the disgusting column done by the Cult Montreal. I think that, frankly, the action needed would be a very large, very significant series of actions because, like you said, there are many institutions in Canada that receive public funds that are publishing very biased work, normally biased towards the leftist sphere. I can give you an example that we covered at True North earlier this week. The Liberals were silent on funding for the anti-hate network, which was actually linked to the Antifa group in court. Actually, a court ruling actually suggested that it has insisted Antifa. Antifa, of course, is under much scrutiny south of the border, given the fact that they are being possibly designated as a terrorist group in the United States. As well as that, there has always been some violent events and violent engagements they've had at protests across North America, including in Canada, as recently as a week and a half ago at Christie Pitts in Toronto. So I think absolutely there's going to be a load of organizations that should receive the public scrutiny, but whether or not the Minister of Heritage, Steven Guilbeault, who is probably one of the most leftist-leaning individuals in the Liberal government today, would take action, I think it's a little bit far beyond taking action. Of course, Montreal, like you said, not only received $47,000 in 2020, but received subsequent additional grants. Other media organizations receive similar amounts, larger amounts when it comes to other forms of financial support. Through COVID, we saw with the wage subsidy. So I definitely don't think actual funds are going to have actual action will happen overall. And I would be very surprised if any funds were actually withdrawn from Cult Montreal.
That's it for today, folks. Thanks for tuning in. You can stay on top of new episodes every weekday by subscribing to the Daily Brief on iTunes and Spotify. Also, while you're at it, make sure to hit us with a 5-star rating and please leave a review.